Thank you very much. I hope it comes as no surprise that I'm going to speak in English and not in Russian. If I speak in Russian, it'll be very short. And I'm very grateful to everyone for coming, and I'm grateful for the introduction and for the invitation to be here. I understand that this is examination time, so I can tell you when I was a student, when there were examinations, I didn't go to lectures that I didn't have to go to. So it's very impressive that everybody, even in the middle of examinations, is finding some time to go to some lecture that is not required. I'm very grateful and an honor to be here. My wife and I were last in Moscow in 1982. So to say that things have changed a little bit is a slight understatement. It's really extraordinarily exciting to see what's happened here. And what I'd like to talk about a little bit is, I'm leaving plenty of time for questions, which I hope you'll ask questions, because the initial indication is that people are being a little shy. So if anybody wants to get closer, you're welcome to. But I do hope that you'll ask questions and we can talk a little bit together. But what I'd like to try to do is talk a little bit about what's happened to the Jewish people by virtue of the creation of the State of Israel over the course of the last 70 years or even 100 years. And I want to go back 100 years more or less to 1917, because 1917 is the year of the Balfour Declaration, when the British Empire, that is about to capture Palestine in the First World War, declares that it's the intent of the British Empire to create what they call a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. There were no maps, and there was no very specific determination of what that national home would be like. But since we're in 2018 now, we're more or less about a century after the Balfour Declaration. And obviously in this country also, 1917 is an extremely important and transformative year. So it's interesting to talk about the histories and stories of peoples and their homelands and the changing chapters in their ongoing journey 100 years or 101 years later. And just like in this country, one really can't understand what's happening here without understanding the various chapters that came before, and understand how each chapter is in some ways a reaction to the chapters that came before, and what was learned and what was changed and so on and so forth. Exactly the same thing is true in Israel. And we tend to pick up the newspaper in the morning and read about what's happening in Syria or read what's happening with Gaza and so on and so forth, without understanding the larger context of what the country was meant to do and how the people who live in the country understand what the purpose of the country is. And that's what I'd like to talk a little bit about today, because this is the Faculty of the Humanities, which is dealing, I guess, with larger issues, with cultural issues, with historical issues, with literary issues, and so forth, to try to focus on that. And the question that I really want to ask is, what has the creation of a Jewish state, which is now celebrating its 70th year? Israel was created in 1948, like India, by the way, both of which had been part of the British Empire and then in various different ways left the British Empire in 1948. What has happened to the Jewish people in the last 70 years because of the creation of the Jewish state? And then we can talk, if you want, about more contemporary issues or other larger issues, whatever you see fit to discuss before you run back to the library or to prepare for exams. So I want to talk about a few different ways in which I think the existential condition, the fundamental nature of the Jewish people in the year 2018, for example, is very different from what it was 70 years ago or 100 years ago because of the creation of the state. And I'll point to just 3, maybe 4, depending on time, 3 or 4 different basic ways in which I think things have very much changed. Sort of the big ideas at the core of this experiment called the Jewish state. One of the first things that I think one has to understand in order to understand how the Jewish people, whether they live in Israel or they live anywhere else, how the Jewish people understands what the Jewish state has changed for the Jewish people, is to understand that with the creation of the Jewish state, there's a certain kind of Jew who disappears. And the Jew who disappears in 1948 is the Jew who has nowhere to go. There have forever been Jewish people who literally had nowhere to go. They were kicked out of wherever they lived, and there was no alternative place for them to go. And this was not only a product of the Second World War, this had happened many, many centuries before. So, for example, in 1290, in the year 1290, the King of England decides no more Jews, and all the Jews get thrown out of England. Now you have to remember that in 1290, when any people is exiled from one place to another, you don't go online and wire your assets ahead to wherever you're headed and go meet them when you get there. You become instantaneously the poorest of the poor of the poor. Because what can you take with you? You probably don't have an animal that you can put things on, maybe you do. You probably don't have a cart or a wagon that you could put things on, maybe you do. You have you and your husband or wife and your children. And if you don't die on the way to wherever it is that you're going, when you get there, you have basically whatever you can hold in your arms. That's it. So an entire community of people, for example, England in 1290, goes from being at whatever level they were in the economy beforehand to being at the very, very bottom of the economy, wherever they end up. The same thing happens, of course, at the end of the 15th century in Spain, right? In the 1485, let's say, Jews are fairly well positioned in the government, in the economy, in the world of culture and arts and literature. They're doing very well in Spain. But in 1492, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabel decide, because of the Catholic Church and so forth, theological issues, they don't want any more Jews in Spain. So again, they give them three choices. You can convert, or you can leave, or you can get burned at the stake. And there were Jews who did each of those things. There were some Jews who left, and some Jews who converted, and a lot of Jews who were killed. And of course, the same thing happens in Germany and in Poland during the Second World War. The single largest Jewish community in the Second World War. Before the Second World War was Poland. It was really the only place where Jews had lived as millions of Jews for centuries, 4, 5, 6 centuries uninterrupted. But just to give you an idea, before the war there are 3 million Jews in Poland, and at the end of the war there's 300,000 Jews in Poland. Meaning 90% are gone. They didn't leave. They didn't go anywhere. They went up in ashes into the sky. So this idea, now what happened to these Jews in Poland? The Jews in Poland, actually, some of them who understood earlier on what was trying to happen, wanted to leave, and some of them got out. The problem was, where do you go? So you couldn't go anywhere in Europe because Europe was at war and in flames. The United States closed its borders. There were ships full of Jews, one was called the St. Louis, that got right to the very edge of the nautical borders of the United States. The United States did not allow the ship in. In the case of the St. Louis, it had left from Germany, it went to Cuba. Cuba didn't take it in. It went north to the United States. The United States did not take it in. Some people were dispersed in Western European countries, but a very large percentage of the people on the St. Louis ultimately got taken right back to Germany, where they had started a few months earlier, and about 25% of them ended up dying in concentration camps and going up chimneys. The United States borders were closed. Canada's borders were closed. Europe was obviously impossible, and the borders of Palestine were closed by the British. And so we don't have enough time today, but I could give you example after example after example of boats filled with Jews, the Exodus, the St. Louis, the Struma. I mean, there's many of them. Each story is a little bit different, but these are people who have nowhere to go. They're Jewish people. There's literally no place on planet Earth that will take them. None. And one of the things that the creation of the State of Israel does for the Jewish people is that it creates an end to that condition. Some people will live in Israel, some Jews will live elsewhere. But the Jews who live elsewhere will always know that if something happens in their own country that forces them to leave, they don't have to ask themselves, is there some place that I can go? Since 1948, that has not been a question. So when there were the attacks on Jews in Argentina and Buenos Aires a few decades ago, not all the Jews left, but the Jews who did want to leave knew that they had a place to go. When things have gotten more complicated for Jews in France over the past 5, 6, 7 years, not all French Jews have left, but the Jews in France knew that they had a place to go, and there was a few years ago a very large influx of French Jews to Israel. It's quieted down now, and some have actually gone back, but they do that. If you follow what's going on with the Labour Party in England now, there's a tremendous worry among English Jews that if the Labour Party comes into power, with Jeremy Corbyn at the head of the Labour Party, things are going to be very unpleasant for Jews in England. That's very sad for Jewish life in England, but again, those Jews have no question, is there going to be a place for me to go? Because the very definition of the Jewish state, and one of the first laws that the Jewish state ever passed, was what's called the law of return. That Jews who had at least one Jewish grandparent, which was the same definition of Jewishness that Hitler used. Hitler called you a Jew if any one of your 4 grandparents was a Jew. So the argument of the law of return was, if you were Jewish enough for Hitler to send you to a concentration camp, then you're Jewish enough for us to accept you as a citizen to the state of Israel. And I'm sure you know that many Jews from the former Soviet Union used exactly that law and exactly that definition to come to Israel, mostly in previous decades, and a few a little bit more recently. So the first thing that changes for the Jewish people as a whole, as a result of the creation of the State of Israel, is that this particular creation called a Jew who has nowhere to go no longer exists. And that changes the entire way in which the Jews think about themselves, and a way in which I think Europe, in large measure, thinks about the Jews. Theodor Herzl, who was kind of the ideological father of modern Zionism, he believed actually that if the Jews created a state, they would be like everybody else. They would be like the French and the Italians and the Spanish and the Germans and the Russians and the Irish. They would be normal. All of those peoples have homelands. All of those peoples have lived on those homelands for many hundreds of years. And the Jews would be like everybody else, and that would stop, he thought, the problem of European anti-Semitism. Herzl believed, he dies in 1904, so he doesn't live to see any of this happen or not happen, but Herzl believes very explicitly, especially when he writes his book called The Jewish State in 1896, he says very explicitly that if the Jews can ever create a state of their own, one of the things that will happen is that European anti-Semitism will end. There he was wrong. Right? Because there is a Jewish state, but British anti-Semitism has not ended, and French anti-Semitism has not ended, and Hungarian anti-Semitism has not ended, and Austrian anti-Semitism has not ended. So he was wrong about that. But he was right to a certain extent that having a state would make the Jew like all other people, which will bring me to the second major dimension I think that it's very important for us to understand, how Israelis and Jews, I think about this state. How has the creation of this state changed the Jewish people? Not just the Jews who live there, but how has it changed what Jewish peoplehood is all about? And here I think really there's no audience that could understand this better than a Russian audience. Because what culture is there that understands better than Russians and Russian students of the humanities, especially the unique relationship and the connection between culture, literature, language, and homeland? I mean, those are all things that feed into all of the great works of the traditions of Russian literature. And if you take any of those things away, the idea of peoplehood or culture or the language, I mean, Dostoevsky could not have written what he wrote in French. Right? He could tell the same story, but it doesn't work the same way in French or in English or in German. He's been translated into Hebrew also. I haven't read it in Hebrew, I read it in English. But it can't work the way it works in Russian. Even the names of people in Russian literature speak differently than they do in other languages, in the same way that when Israelis Hebraicize their names, they take their European names and change them into Hebrew names, they're making a similar kind of a statement. So I think there's really nobody better in the world than an audience of Russian university students to understand that this connection between literature and culture and language and land is a deeply important connection for all great cultures. What did the Jews have? The Jews had for a very long time a relationship to a land, but they weren't in the land for the most part. They had a language in the early days, thousands of years ago. That language was Hebrew. And that language is no longer a spoken language after the exile in 586 BCE. After that point, a little bit later also, but not much, Jews stopped speaking Hebrew. Hebrew will remain as a kind of a religious language, a language of liturgy and a language of sacred texts, but nobody speaks Hebrew. Jews will then start to speak Aramaic. When they go to Babylonia, the Jewish language will become Aramaic. With the rise of Islam in the 6th century, though, the great communities of Babylonia, or what's now today Iraq and Iran, they begin to subside, and Jews are going to mostly move to North Africa, where they're going to speak Arabic, and then they're going to move mostly to Eastern Europe, where they're going to speak a unique blend of sort of Hebrew and German, which is going to become Yiddish. So for a very long time, especially in Europe, the major Jewish language is Yiddish. But as I'm sure you're aware, the vast majority of the people in the world who speak Yiddish are exterminated during the Second World War. And it's only because more or less, a couple of decades before that, the project of returning Hebrew to being a spoken language was actually part of the Zionist project. The early Zionists believed that if we're going to have a state, the state needs to actually have a language. Now, what languages do the Jews speak in that state, or before the state? They speak Russian, because a lot of them have come from Russia. They speak Arabic, because some of them lived in Palestine or came from the Levant, North Africa, Yemen, Iraq, Iran. They speak some German, because some of them have come from Germany. The one language that they don't speak is Hebrew, because nobody speaks Hebrew, basically. But a man named Eliezer ben Yehuda begins this dramatic revolutionary project of transforming Hebrew into the day-to-day language of the Jewish people. And if you try to imagine what Russian peoplehood would be like without the Russian language, and then add to that picture the richness of the Russian language, that's exactly what happens to Jewish peoplehood when it's without its language, and then you add to it the richness of a language which is thousands and thousands of years old. In 1948, probably, well, not in 48, but let's say in 1917, you probably could have taken all the people in the world who spoke Hebrew and put them very easily on this campus. Now, that would be a challenge today, with some 8 million people living in Israel and millions more across the world speaking Hebrew. There's 1 million Israelis in the United States, there's Israelis all over Europe. There's probably, I don't know, 10, 11 million people around the world who speak Hebrew now, and to put all of them on this campus would probably be a challenge. But in 1917, you could easily have taken all the people on the planet who spoke Hebrew and put them on this campus, and there would be extra room. Nowadays, obviously, everything has been transformed. Now, what has happened as a result of that? What's happened as a result of that is that Jews are not only, and Jews and Israelis in particular, are not only the consumers of international culture, they're also the producers of international culture. The highway of culture, or the roadway of culture, goes in both directions. So, great works of literature, whether it's Hemingway in America, or Shakespeare in England, or Dostoevsky in Russia, or Flaubert in France, they're all translated into Hebrew. But by the same token, works of great literature that are written in Hebrew are now making their way all across the world in the other direction. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar, but there's a very well-known British prize called the Man Booker Prize. It's kind of the #2 prize to the Nobel Prize in literature. The Nobel is the most prestigious, and #2 pretty much is the Man Booker Prize. The Man Booker Prize is given to a book written in any language. It just has to be translated into English so that the judges can read it. But it's open to anybody in any language. So imagine how many books all across the world, hundreds and hundreds, probably thousands and thousands of books a year ago are now contestants for the Man Booker Prize in 1917. And eventually the Man Booker Prize announces the 5 finalists. Just about a year and 3 months ago, something like that. Of the 5 finalists of books all over the world, 2 of the 5 finalists are Israelis who write in Hebrew. In other words, 2 of them are people who write in a language that 100 years earlier, literally nobody spoke. Literally nobody spoke. And they were David Grossman and Amos Oz. Meir Shalev, who actually was in Moscow until earlier today, has been speaking around Moscow for a few days. He wasn't a finalist, but his books, of course, are also translated all over the world into dozens of languages. So in the end, by the way, David Grossman won the award. He won the Man Booker Prize last year. Even though, ironically, he's younger than Amos Oz, and in some ways sees himself as Amos Oz's student in a kind of a way. He talks about how when he was younger, Amos Oz was his inspiration. He won the prize, and his teacher didn't win the prize. That happens. He won the prize, by the way, for a very... Is it translated into Russian? Do you know? It's called, in English, it's called A Horse Walks Into a Barn. And I'm told that it's translated into Russian. What's it called in Russian? Okay,
It's
okay.
a new book.
Okay, it just came out? Okay, great. I highly recommend it. After your examinations, I highly recommend it. It takes place, the whole book takes place in one night in a stand-up bar. In other words, there's a comedian who gets up and does his act, and the whole book is basically his monologue. And it's a very painful book in a lot of ways, and it will give you a little bit of a window or of an insight into the issues that Israelis are thinking about and wrestling with. So the second thing, if the first thing that the creation of the State of Israel does is that it ends the existence of this particular kind of a Jew who has nowhere to go, which completely changes the way in which Jews think about themselves. It now says to the Jewish people, you're part of the economy of international culture. You're consumers, but you're also producers. And it can be literature, like Meir Shalev or Amos Oz or David Grossman or many others. It can be television with Fauda. Everybody's talking about Fauda. People all over the world are trying to find out when Netflix is going to have Fauda. Actually, Netflix has put out the second season of Fauda in every country in the world except for Israel and France. I don't know why those two countries. So when we got to Moscow yesterday, the first thing that I did is I downloaded it and now take it back to Israel and I can watch it there. So very grateful that it's available in Russia, but it's not available in Hebrew, in Israel, even though we produced it. But it could be Fauda, it could be Homeland, or the Eurovision thing a few weeks ago. There's a big debate in Israel if that's even a song. But Israel did win. And again, even if it's not a good song, even if it's a terrible song, even if it's not a song, Israel won. And it's a reminder to Israelis that there's this kind of Jewish voice, which is a participant in international culture in a way that 30, 40 years ago was really not the case. We were very much importers of culture, but not necessarily exporters of culture. So having a state has been more than having a border or an army or an embassy or a voice at the UN, all of those standard political things. It is, as I said, given Jews everywhere across the world the knowledge that they have a home, and it has reintroduced the Jewish people to the international economy of culture. The last one or two that I'll mention, the first one is this, and now I do want to say a brief bit about one of the wars, and I think that one of the unfortunate things about the conversation that we have about Israel, we have it, by the way, in the United States this way, we have it in Israel this way, and I'm guessing that very often the conversation is conducted this way in Russia as well, is that when one thinks about Israel, one talks about the conflict. But the United States has been, I'm American originally, the United States has been at war in some way, someplace in the world, every day since I've been alive. Not always major wars, but there's never been a day since I was alive that the American Armed Forces was not somewhere doing something. But to tell the story of the United States as being the story just of those wars, of course, is to miss the point of what the United States is all about. And Russia, and before that the Soviet Union, and before that Russia also fought a series of wars, but I think everybody in the humanities faculty understands that to talk about the history of this nation only through the wars are an important part, but to talk about the history of this nation only through the lens of the wars is to miss a huge portion of the greatness and the grandeur of this culture and of this nation. And the same thing is true of Israel. Very often we talk about 1948, 1956, 1967, 1973, 2000, 2006, 2012, 2014 so far, as if that's the story. That's not really the story. That's one part of the story. Probably a better part of the story would be to talk about the appearance of great works of literature, or Nobel Prizes won, or Man Booker Prizes won, or important demographic accomplishments. Israel is 10 times as populous today as it was in 1948. In 1948, there were 600,000 Jews in Israel. Today, there are 6-point-something million Jews in Israel. In 70 years, that's an unbelievable story. There's probably very few other countries anywhere in the world that can point to that kind of growth in the space of 70 years. That's a different kind of a story. But I do, for a minute, though, want to talk about one of the wars, which is the 1967 war, and say something about that, because that's also part of how I think the existence of the state has changed the way in which the Jewish people thinks about itself and the way in which the world thinks differently about the Jewish people. What's important about the 1967 war is not that Israel won. Israel is one of those countries that has no choice but to win every single war, for reasons that we'll come back to. The United States, where I grew up, does not have to win every single war. It did not win the Korean War, the results of which you can see in the newspaper today. It didn't lose, it didn't win. It just accomplished nothing, basically. But it didn't change life in America. Nothing changed. And the only thing that happened inside the United States because of the Vietnam War, which America definitely lost, the only thing that changed was a little bit of American politics, because the popular movement to get out of Vietnam gave a certain amount of fuel to the Democratic Party and left-wing American politics. But the vast majority of Americans didn't know anybody who fought in Vietnam. I mean, thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of soldiers died there, but there's 360 million Americans. Most people didn't know anybody who fought in Vietnam. And when America lost the Vietnam War, exactly nothing changed in America. Nothing. The soldiers came home. That was it. It was never about America's survival. Israel's never fought a war like that. Israel's never fought a war in which you can say, okay, if we lose this one, we lose this one. You know, it happens. I don't mean to be cavalier, obviously, about all the lives that are lost and all the suffering of people who are wounded. Obviously, that's a huge issue in any war. But Israel's never fought a war like that. So when I say what's important about 67 is not the fact that Israel won, I don't mean that it doesn't matter that Israel won. It matters a lot that Israel won, because if it hadn't won, there'd be no discussion here today. One of these flags wouldn't be here, right? But what I want to point out specifically with 1967 is that what's really important is not just the victory, and not just the fact that Israel triples its size in 6 days, which changes everything for a country, right? When it's 3x the size, 6 days later, less than a week later, there's a tremendous amount about that country that's going to change. Demographically, politically, geographically, in a whole array of ways. But what I want to point to is the fact that in 1967, Israel attacked first, and why that matters. For thousands of years, as I said when we talked about the first point, basically the way the Jews saw their own history was that they waited to see what was going to happen to them next. The world did something, and we responded. We either fled, or we didn't flee, or we converted, or we didn't convert, or we did survive, or we didn't survive. But the world acted, and then we responded. That was certainly the case in the middle of the 20th century in the Second World War. Europe acted, and by and large, the Jews had no options for responding. And that created a certain kind of self-perception among Jews that on the chessboard, we're the pawns. We're the little guys. Things happen to us. We don't determine our own future. The goal of the state was to change that. The goal of the state was, we're going to write our own future. To one extent or another, the French write their own future. The British write their own future. The Russians write their own future. The Jews, said the state, we're now also going to write their own future. But in 1948, that didn't really happen. And 1956 didn't change anything. In May 1967, everybody knows that war is coming. Everybody knows that war is going to happen because Nasser, who's the president of Egypt, has announced that war is coming. And Assad, not this Assad, the father Assad, who's the president of Syria, has announced that there's going to be a war. And Nasser is very clear about what his intention is. He says it publicly. He says publicly, we're going to push all the Jews into the sea. So you know the map. Egypt's going to come up from the south, Syria's going to come down from the north, they're going to push towards the west, and push all the Jews, they say, into the Mediterranean Sea. Now, because of what had happened in the 20th century, Jews actually believe their enemies when they say that their intention is to destroy them. They don't say, they're just talking. Because in 1939 and in 1941, that's what the Jews had said in Berlin. There were Jews in Berlin in 1939 who heard what Hitler was saying. They said, it's just talk. But by 1967, nobody says that anymore. By 1967, which is not that much later, it's only 20 years, 25 years later, Jews take very seriously the warnings of their enemies when their enemies say, we're going to destroy you. Nobody's laughing, and nobody thinks It's just talk. They know it's serious. So in ways that even many Israelis haven't forgotten, in the month of May 1967, Israel is preparing for the worst. People are talking about a kind of a third temple falling. The first temple fell in 586 BCE. Second temple was destroyed in 70 CE. And people like Moshe Dayan, who will say this again in 73, even more, with more worry, talk about this could be the end. There's kind of black humor in every society. And in an Israeli society, a joke going around, sort of a joke, right, but not really a joke. The joke going around in 1967 was, as some Israelis were fleeing, a lot of Israelis went to the airport, which is now called the Tel Aviv airport, but it's really in a little town called Lod. And the joke was, the last person to leave Lod, please turn out the lights. In other words, it was a kind of a dark black humor where Israelis really foresaw the end. And in May 1967, Israel dug about 10,000 graves all across the country in public parks and in playgrounds and in open areas. 10,000 graves, because that was the prediction of the number of civilians who might get killed in this war if Israel even survived it at all. But at the end of the day, of course, as most of you probably know, in the first week of June 1967, Israel did something that the Jews had not done for 2,000 years, which was instead of waiting to see what would happen to them, Israel struck first. And Israel had intelligence that the Egyptian Air Force, all of its personnel, all of them, ate breakfast at exactly the same time. The pilots, the mechanics, everybody. So they knew what hour that was. It was 7:45 in the morning, and exactly at the time when there was nobody anywhere in the planes or whatever, Israeli Air Force attacked the Egyptian Air Force and destroyed it on the ground before a single plane could take off, and the war was really over before it started. Again, what matters now is not capturing the Sinai and capturing the Golan and the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. All of those are very complicated issues, which are complicated to this very day. But what I want us to understand in terms of talking about the existential condition of the Jew, and with this I'll stop so we can have a little bit of time for questions, is that this is the first time in 2,000 years when Jews do not wait to see what is going to happen to them. This is the first time in 2,000 years which Jews say, we are going to determine what happens to us. And that's mainly the reason why Israel wins the war, because it can take out the Egyptian Air Force before the Egyptian Air Force can turn on the jets, much less take off. And again, what's important is not exactly which battles were fought, but that Israelis emerged from that war with a sense, we're now like everybody else. We don't have to wait and see what's going to happen to us. We want to determine and shape our own future the way everybody else shapes and determines their own future. So let me just end by saying the following, and then we can take it wherever you'd like to take it. I think that the tendency when one is not Israeli, and therefore, or is not necessarily a mini studies major, so you're interested, but you don't follow it in all of the granular detail. The tendency can be to say, oh, this is what's happening on the Gaza fence now, or Trump moved the embassy, that's why there's rioting, or Netanyahu is a right-wing government, that's why this is happening. All of that is legitimate, but I think it doesn't capture the story. In the same way that to say, the Russian government is doing this, and this is the new policy in Moscow, etc., that's all true, but it doesn't follow the grand story of this people in its ancestral land, and what's been created here, and what it comes from, and so on and so forth. That's the grand story. And just as this culture, and this society, and this heritage has a grand story, so does the state of Israel have a grand story. And I think that grand story is really the rebirth of the Jewish people. After 2,000 years of exile and 2,000 years of homelessness. And again, just to summarize very quickly, I think that three of the main things that get changed are, number one, that the Jewish people now knows that every single Jew has a place that they can go. This phenomenon of the homeless Jew no longer exists after 1948. Number two, we rejoin the family of nations, not only as consumers of culture internationally, but as also producers and providers of culture internationally. And you know how important is the production of Russian culture to the place of the Russian people in the international world. Same thing is true for the Jewish people and so forth. And it's Israel that ultimately makes that happen, because it's Israel that gives life to the Hebrew language, and it's Israel that gives Jewish writers a kind of a national platform from which to write, especially after the death of Yiddish in the Second World War. And the last thing is that it changes the way in which Jews think about themselves and others think about the Jews, because we no longer wait to see what's going to happen to us, but we actually, like everyone else, as I said, all these other great cultures across Europe are now the authors and the writers and the shapers of our own future and our own destiny and what's going to happen to us. So I think that the real story of Israel is not what's in today's news or yesterday's news or tomorrow's news, but it's that grand story. And I think that as the embassy, which I'm grateful for the invitation to, is actually doing a tremendous amount of programming this year to kind of mark Israel's 70th anniversary, I think that's the critical thing to think about. What's the story of the Jewish people and how has it been changed by a country which is still very young in many ways, but which I think is successful far beyond what anybody might have imagined it would be in 1948. And to at least suggest those three ways of thinking about some of the ways in which it's been successful. So I'll stop with that, and I'm grateful again for your time, and I'm happy to open it up, answer questions to whatever extent I can. Don't be shy.
Спасибо. Вопрос.
You can ask the question in Russian and somebody will translate it, that's okay too. Okay, there we go. One brave person, yeah.
What is the actual definition of Jewishness in use in the Israeli state?
What's the actual
Definition of Jewishness.
definition? Okay, so we're going to be here until exams are over, I see. That's a complicated question, because there are different ways of defining Jewishness in different parts of Israeli society. So I'll give you the first two pieces, and then one of the pieces we have to also subdivide. There's a question between a national definition and a religious definition. In Jewish law, in Jewish religious law, traditional Jewish religious law, at least, a person who is Jewish is a person whose mother is Jewish, or is a person who is converted to Judaism. So if neither of your parents were Jewish, according to traditional Jewish law now only, if neither of your parents was Jewish or your father was Jewish, then Jewish, religiously speaking, you're not Jewish. And if you want to be Jewish, you have to convert. And there's a ceremony that you go through and you can convert. And once you convert, you're as Jewish as anybody else. That's the religious definition. But Israel has always employed two different definitions. One definition was the religious definition, which the Ministry of Religion uses. So if I want to go to get married, and my fiance and I go to the Ministry of Religion, and we want to get a marriage license, they want to know that we're both Jewish, that's the definition of Jewishness that they're going to use. Both of us have to have had Jewish mothers or have converted. If we're not, then they're going to say one of you is not Jewish, the other of you is Jewish, you can't get married, in which case if you're Israeli, you go to Cyprus and get married or something like that, but you can't get married in Israel. But the Ministry of the Interior, Israel's other ministry that deals with this, has used the definition that I gave before, which is one Jewish grandparent will make you Jewish. And as I said before, that was as a result of the definition that the Nazis actually used for their definition of who was Jewish enough to be rounded up and sent off to extermination camps. Now, so what's very strange about the Israeli system is you can be a person who's recognized as a Jew by one ministry and not recognized as a Jew by another ministry. And actually the population of people that has dealt with this more than anybody else is Russian Jews. I mean, this is a big deal in Israel, mostly because of the Russian Jews. In other words, there's other groups like Ethiopian Jews, about whom there's some question of whether or not to consider them Jews. Some people have a question about it. But that's not because one grandparent was Jewish, another grandparent wasn't Jewish. They're either all or nothing. They're either all Jews or none of them are Jews because of the whole group of people. In this particular community, as I'm sure many of you know better than I do, approximately 1 million Jews or 1 million people came to Israel under the law of return once the gates opened up. And many of them were people who were called Jews by the Ministry of the Interior. They were what's called in Hebrew, Zaka'ei Chok HaShvut, people who were eligible to come back to Israel by the law of return, because one of their 4 grandparents had been Jewish. But again, the Ministry of the Interior, the Ministry of Religion only cared if your mother and your mother's mother had been Jewish, which puts a lot of people in a bind. In other words, they find themselves in a very strange position in Israel. The Israeli rabbinate, the rabbis of Israel, who are very conservative with a small c, almost fundamentalist, are very inflexible on this. and they will only include people who are Jewish, whose mother and grandmother and so on forth were Jewish, or if they convert in an Orthodox conversion. But because in a country of 8 million people, 1 million Soviet immigrants is a lot of people, it's a huge percentage of the population, there are all kinds of things that people are doing to try to make it easier for these people to become Jewish. So for example, the army, everybody in Israel serves in the army, men and women serve. Men serve 3 years, women serve 2 years. And the army actually, there's a program right near our school where I teach, which is called Nativ. And the Army's program called Nativ is designed to make it easier for soldiers who fall into this category. Most of them are the children or grandchildren of Soviet emigres, not all of them, but most of them. Makes it easier for them to convert. They get time off from the Army to do their studying. The chief rabbinate is kept out, and the Army rabbinate, which is known to be more flexible and more tolerant, does it. And the chief rabbinate sort of looks the other way, pretends it doesn't know what's going on. But not everybody does it. I'll give you an example. We have a woman in my school where I teach. Her parents came to Israel from the former Soviet Union. Her mother's not Jewish, her father is Jewish. So according to the Ministry of the Interior, she was allowed in, they were allowed in, but she is, according to Jewish religious law, not Jewish. And she chose, when she and I spoke about it, she said she chose not to convert. She had that opportunity in the army. She didn't want it. She said, I was born in Israel, I speak Hebrew, I went to the army, I feel completely Israeli, and I don't really care what the rabbinate thinks. I think of myself as Jewish, and it doesn't matter to me what they think. I'm not going through any conversion. Fine, that's her right. Now she just had a baby, like 4 or 5 weeks ago, so now she has a little boy. When that little boy grows up and he wants to get married, that's going to be an issue for him too. She understands that. If the law in Israel hasn't changed, then he'll have to figure out what he wants to do. Either he'll convert, or he and the woman that he eventually wants to marry will go abroad and get married abroad, which you can do, whatever. But so people make different choices. Some people convert with the rabbinate. Some people convert in the army because it's a little bit easier and more flexible. Some people don't convert. But the answer to your question basically is that Israel has 2 very different definitions. And until the 1980s, it was true, but it was on the books, but it didn't really matter because there was very few people who fell into that category. When 1 million Russian people came in from the former Soviet Union, and many of them fell into this category, it's become a huge social, religious, demographic, moral issue in Israeli society. So you're touching on an issue that Israelis talk about a lot. And it's what I gave you was the current status. It may change in the course of time. The rabbinate might change. The Ministry of the Interior could change. But that's where it stands now. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Еще вопросы?
Question, but it's not really connected with the history. I'm just curious to know your opinion. As you know, there are women soldiers in Israel, and they have to serve the military for about 2 years. And I want to know, what do you think about this system? Do you think that, for example, women in the United States or in Russia or in the rest of the world in general should serve the military?
That's an interesting question. I don't know anything about the Russian military, so I will not answer the question about the Russian military. There's 2 countries that I do know something, Israel and America. So this probably did not make the Russian newspapers because it's not that interesting a story. But about, 4 or 5 weeks ago in America, a domestic flight, just an airplane flight from, Philadelphia to wherever, was flying and the engine blew up. And a piece of the engine flew through the window of the jet, and a person got actually sucked out the window mostly, and the plane obviously was in big trouble, and then the pilot did an excellent job and landed the plane, and apparently it's a complicated thing to do with no cabin pressure and only 1 engine. I'm not a pilot, but I'm told that it was a very big to do. Why was it an interesting story? Because the woman was a pilot, the pilot was a woman, and she was the first Navy American pilot that was allowed to fly in combat. So this raised again the whole issue in America of the importance of allowing people to to serve in the military, to prove that women are just as good as men at pilots, and everybody said she did an unbelievable job and she's a superb pilot and so forth. Look, I actually am in favor in Israel of women serving in the army. I'll speak only about Israel, and I'll speak as the father of a daughter who did serve in the army, and for whom it was a very valuable experience. Now she's not in the army anymore. Now she's a lawyer and she's a mother, and I have 700 videos of my granddaughter I'm happy to show you afterwards. You can stay around for 4 days and you'll just tell me how cute she is, and you'll be right. But look, I think for my daughter it was a very important process. First of all, she was drafted for 2 years and she served for 3. She felt what she was doing was important and they wanted her to stay, and she agreed to stay. Why is it important? First of all, in Israel, the army is a very central part of society. In America, a very small percentage of the society serves. It tends to be mostly poor people from small towns. If you look statistically in the United States at who gets killed in America's wars, Iraq, Afghanistan, whatever, not wars where everybody gets drafted like the Second World War or Vietnam, but little wars now where now we have what's called a volunteer army. You go to the army in America, if you volunteer to go, it's like a job. You sign up for a job, you get training and so forth. You also get your university paid for afterwards. So who tends to go? The people who tend to go in America are people who, if they don't go to the army, can't go to university because they don't have enough money. So it tends to be more poor people and people from smaller towns in the middle of America who want to get out of that life, and they want to meet other people, and they want to get into the mainstream of American society. Israel doesn't have that at all. In Israel, rich and poor and religious and secular and white and brown and men and women are all drafted. And the army is a very central, formative experience for everybody. So I think that to keep women out of that would be to keep women out of one of the things in society that actually gives them a boost upward. And if you look, for example, at the women who are at the heads of high-tech firms, or women who are at the heads of industry, and so on and so forth, a huge percentage of them were women who were very successful in the army, and made a lot of connections in the army, and then went forward. Now, they're obviously very talented people, and the likelihood is they would have been talented even if they didn't go to the army. But given how central the army is to Israeli society, my own view is that to keep women out would be to hold women back, because the army actually opens doors for people and is a huge propellant forward. The other thing that I'll say is a kind of a moral point. I mean, I'm saying nothing about Russia, because I really don't know how Russian society works. I'm speaking only about Israel and America a little bit. I think when one grows up in a country that gives a person a tremendous number of advantages, economic, cultural, democratic, I mean a whole array of ways, I think the idea that one owes something back to one's country is actually a noble idea. When I grew up in the United States, I was in high school in the 1970s, and I went to university in the 70s and 80s. It never occurred to me, even though I grew up in a country which we thought, was a great country. There were people here who didn't think so, but okay. We thought it was a great country. And I never asked myself, and my parents never asked me, my teachers never asked me, what are you going to do to give back? I did my first degree, so I did a second degree, so I did a third degree, then I got a job, then I got another job, and one day I'm going to retire, hopefully. That's it. In other words, it was never part of my questioning, what do I owe my country? Just never crossed my mind. And if you and I had met when I was in the middle of the university and you said, at what point are you going to do something to give back to your country? I would have looked at you like you'd said, at what point are you going to jump off a tall building? Like, it just never crossed my mind. And I think that that's unfortunate. In other words, I think that my daughter is a better human being and a fuller human being for having served something other than herself. In other words, she married the man she wanted to marry, that's great. She had the child she wanted to have, that's great. She got the degree she wanted to get, that's great. And I'm glad all those things happened. But I also think she's a better person for having served her country. So I think that the culture in every country is very different. The United States, as a country of 360 million people, does not need to draft all its 18-year-olds into the army. It does not need such a gigantic army. But I will say, there's plenty of work to do in America in the parts of the big cities that are poor, in the parts of the cities where children don't get good educations and they can be taught mathematics or English or the skills that they need to succeed. I think the United States would be a better country if it said to every 18-year-old, you don't have to go to the army, but you do have to give something back to society. I think it would make America a better place. America doesn't do that. I think it does make Israel a better place, and Israel does do that. And what other countries should do, that's up to the people in each of those individual countries.
Еще вопросы?
I just wanted to ask why the attitude of Europeans towards Jewish people didn't change after the creation of state.
That's a great question. Well, okay. First of all, your English is great and your questions are great. If I ever learn Russian, maybe I can come and teach for a semester. But I have a little bit of work to do. I know like 5 words so far. But look, that's a very good. That's a huge question. So first of all, for a short while, it did change. For a short while, there was a sense, I think, on the part of European societies that Europe had betrayed the Jews of Europe. In other words, France, Germany, these were supposedly liberal societies, very advanced societies, that people did one of two things. They either collaborated with the killing of the Jews, or they stood on the side and watched. Those were the two options. Very, 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 very few people did something else. Some did. Some did. In every country there were people who did, but statistically the numbers were very small. The stories are very famous precisely because there are exceptions to the rules, not the rule itself. But there was a sense that if you read, for example, Camus, The Plague, I don't know what that's called in Russian, but Amagifa, Camus, whatever. Albert Camus was a French existentialist writer. He wrote a book called The Plague. He's not Jewish at all. He wrote about really the failure of the French resistance to care about the people that should have cared about. The book came out, I think, in 45 or 48 or something like that. But Camus, even at the end of his book, in the very last 2 paragraphs of his book, The Plague, says the people in the town finally celebrated the end of the plague. The plague is a metaphor, of course, for the Third Reich and everything that came along with it. People celebrated the end of the plague, and they came out of their houses, and they were happy. And then the last paragraph of the book says, but what they didn't understand is that the plague always comes back. That the plague is never really gone. The rats stay in the basement, and then one day they come up to daylight, they spread the germs again, and the plague gets restored. He wasn't really writing about Jews. He was writing about the failure of liberalism. And what happened in European liberalism very, very quickly is this. European liberals recognized that French liberals, British liberals, German liberals, all across Western Europe, had failed the Jew during the Second World War because they had really not, the Nazis went to France and said, give us X number of Jews. They gave them X number of Jews. In certain parts of France, they gave them more than they asked for. Right? German Jews or Polish people watched as the Jews of their town, their neighbors for generations that they've known forever, get rounded up. What did they do? When the trucks left, they went into their apartments and took their stuff. Nobody lifted a finger. Nobody did anything. And there was an awareness that something had failed in the liberal traditions of Western Europe. But how did that get translated? It got translated into, we were wrong, we did not do what we needed to do, never again will we allow the weak and the weak to be victimized by the powerful. But what happens? 19 years after Israel's created is the 67 war, and all of a sudden it looks like the powerful is the Jew and the weak is the Palestinian. So the very kind of recrafting of European liberalism after the war, which said we're always going to be there for the victim, now ironically, that actually puts Israel as the oppressor, as the colonialist, as the evil party, and it puts the Palestinians as the victim that needs to be protected. I think that's part of it. The other part of it, which obviously is too big a thing to do any justice to, but I'll just say it, and then I think it's about 12 o'clock, I don't have to end up to the dean, but look, there's part of Christian theology which has at its core a hostility to Jewishness, because of the accusation in the Synoptic Gospels that the Jews were responsible for the death of Jesus. And I think most liberal Christian theologians in Western Europe and in America will tell you that that's something that Christian theology always has to sort of overcome. The default position is, in a sense, like a kind of an instinctive. The Jew did not follow Jesus, the Jews were actually complicit in the death of Jesus, and therefore there's a kind of instinctive hostility to the Jew that even in a secular country like France, or an Anglican country, which is a different kind of form of Christianity like England, it sort of bubbles to the surface periodically. So I think it's a combination of ancient Christian theology and what happened to liberalism after the Second World War, with its focus on the disenfranchised and the weak, and how that changes after the '67 war. And it puts the Jew, once again, at the receiving end of both sides, not where we had hoped that the Jews would be when the war was over in 45 or 46 or 47. It's an excellent, excellent question, and lots more to say about that. But thank you. Thank you all for these questions.
Еще вопросы, пожалуйста.
I have a question about, speaking about wars, can you guess or maybe predict where can a new war happen in nearest time, and most importantly between which countries?
In the world or in the Middle East?
Yes, in the world.
In the world. So the answer to your question is no, I do not know. I have no idea. There's a statement in the Talmud, which is the major Jewish legal work, 20 volumes. It's a big work. A statement in the Talmud that says that after the last of the Bible's prophets, the only people who engage in prophecy are children and fools. So since I'm too old to be a child, unfortunately, and I'd like to think that I'm not a fool, I have absolutely no idea in the world where it's going to be. I mean, the bad news is, of course, that there's lots of wars being fought every day, in Africa and whatever. So, but where the next one is, I don't know. The possibilities are limitless. What I'll just say about the Middle East very briefly is that in the Middle East, the sands are really shifting, right? I mean, 20, 30 years ago, Israel's major enemies were standing states. Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt. That was it, neighbors. Egypt has a peace treaty with Israel, and Egypt is very worried about an Iranian nuclear weapon, so actually Egypt and Israel are allies in the fight against Iran. Saudi Arabia has never gone to war with Israel, but it was never a huge fan of Israel. But Saudi Arabia now allows planes to fly over Saudi Arabia on the way to Israel and so forth. Clearly there's a lot of military cooperation between Israel and Saudi Arabia for the same exact reason. Not because the Saudi prince has become a great Zionist, just because he understands the danger of the Iranian threat. Moving up, Israel and Jordan have a peace treaty, and so basically that border is entirely quiet. Moving further up, Syria no longer exists. I mean, there's a country technically called Syria, but it doesn't function anymore. And what's going to happen in Syria is anybody's guess. There are Syrian troops, ISIS troops, American troops, Russian troops, all over Syria. It's a big salad. So, if you're vegan and you like salads, then you love Syria. But what's going to happen in Syria, nobody knows. And Lebanon doesn't really exist either anymore. It's mostly in the hands of Hezbollah. But I think, from Israel's foreign, just speaking as an Israeli for a second, from Israel's foreign policy standpoint, Israelis don't want to fight Hezbollah because it could cause a lot of damage. Israelis don't want to fight ISIS. It could cause a lot of damage. Israelis don't want to fight any of those. Hamas. But Hezbollah and ISIS and Hamas, they can't destroy the Jewish state. Right? To destroy a state, you need tanks and airplanes and thousands of boots on the ground. That's not going to happen. That there's no worry about. They can cause a lot of heartbreak. They can kill a lot of Israelis, but they can't destroy the state. The only really existential threat that Israel faces, ironically, is from a country that doesn't even have a border with Israel. It's Iran. And Iran had very good relations with Israel under the Shah. And then when the Shah fell in 1979, and Ayatollah Khomeini took over as part of the radical Islamic revolution, that's when Iran broke diplomatic ties with Israel. And just yesterday, if you see in today's paper, the head of the Iranian government said once again that Israel is a cancerous germ that needs to be eradicated. Why? Because That's a good reason. I wouldn't suggest that you answer any of your exam questions that way. If the question says why something, don't write just because. It's not a really good idea. I have a feeling, but that I have no better explanation to you, except that it's some sort of, because, why not? But the irony is they don't share a border with Israel. They once had very good relations with Israel. But the Iranian Revolution has decided that Israel is fundamentally an evil country that needs to be destroyed. That's Israel's only potential existential enemy at this point. As long as they're not a nuclear power, they're not an existential enemy. If they become a nuclear power, then they really do become an existential enemy. Now, I don't know how closely you follow the Middle East, but if there's any one issue that has been Prime Minister Netanyahu's major focus, it is Iran. He went to Congress even though President Obama did not want him to go to Congress, and he tried to stop the Iran deal, and he couldn't. And he's currently dating President Trump, and the relationship's going very well, and he's trying to stop the Iran deal. And this morning, the Iranians announced that they're going to start enriching uranium. This is a cat and mouse game. It's clearly not over. How it's going to play out, I don't know. But if Israelis are really, so I ask you a question from the point of view of Israelis. From the Israeli point of view, what's the one conflict that has everybody very worried? It's Iran. All the other organizations can cause tremendous damage, but they can't destroy the state. And Israelis worry about all of them to a certain extent, but Iran more than anything else. And the reason, by the way, that Netanyahu is very popular in Israel, even though not everybody likes his personality, and not everybody likes his economic policies, and not everybody thinks he's the most honest person in the world, and all of that, the reason fundamentally, if he calls elections tomorrow, he will win an even bigger majority in the Knesset, which is our parliament. He'll definitely win a bigger majority, is because Israelis feel he understands the Iranian threat, that he's been very articulate about the Iranian threat with the United States and Western Europe, and even with Putin. In terms of stopping Iran from getting into Syria, he was just here not that long ago talking with Putin about that. And Israelis think that's the one existential threat their country faces, and they trust him to handle it smartly. And that's more important to Israelis than anything else that he might or might not do. So from our perspective, there could be conflicts all over the world. I have no idea, but that's the one conflict that we at least have our eyes on. It's a great question. So thank you all very, very much. I appreciate your coming. It's a great honor to be at the university, and I'm grateful to the invitation and for the hospitality. So thank you, and I wish you all great success on your exams.
Thank you.